In 1993, in the middle of the console war against Sega and the Genesis, Nintendo needed a game to directly answer to Aladdin's animation and graphics to stay on top of the market. For this, they tasked the British company Rare with the then dormant Donkey Kong IP to make a game that would put Aladdin to shame in terms of graphical presentation. After 18 months of tireless 12 to 16 hour workdays, 7 days every week, and $1 million spent on its development, Donkey Kong Country was created and it became an instant hit, setting the record for the fastest selling game at the time, selling 500,000 copies within a week, 6 million copies worldwide in its first holiday season, and reaching a cumulative sales figure of 9.3 million copies, becoming the third best-selling SNES game of all time and completely revitalizing the Donkey Kong IP for years to come, spawning several games on the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, a 3D platformer in the Nintendo 64, and several other experimental games on the GameCube, before returning to its platforming roots on the Wii and Wii U with the return of the Country series, and now coming back once more with a brand new game on the Switch 2 with Donkey Kong Bonanza. But how did this all come to be? Why did Nintendo, known for being so protective of their IPs, decide to outsource this task to Rare? And how did Rare manage to achieve this unlikely partnership? Welcome everyone, I'm Soha, this is Game Over Hell, and welcome to the Donkey Kong Country Trilogy Retrospective. But first, a word from our sponsor. Just joking. We don't have sponsors. Do consider subscribing though. That does help us a lot. Thank you. Our story today starts about 12 years before the release of Donkey Kong Country, before even the NES days, with a company called Ashby Computers and Graphics Limited, also known as Ultimate Play the Game. This company was founded by the Stamper brothers, and their initial focus as ACG was for arcade conversion kits, as the Stampers had much knowledge in developing arcade games, including Konami's Jirus, is what I would say if I took this Commodore user article at face value, but this information has been debunked almost 3 years ago, yet it still is present at the Wikipedia article. The free encyclopedia, free to be wrong! Despite all that, they really did have knowledge in developing arcade games, releasing Blueprint, Graspin, Dingo, and Saturn. Later, however, they shifted their focus to the home computer software market and started developing games under the Ultimate Play the Game brand. While developing games for this market, they experienced much success with releases like Jetpack, Attic Attack, Saberwolf, and Night Lore. And I mean much success, with Jetpack selling around 300,000 copies. For the ZX Spectrum, wow, that's pretty good actually. I mean, okay, sure, the game was sold for like £5 at the time, which today would be equivalent to... Oh wow, okay, it really is successful. However, Ultimate's founders believed that staying in the home computer software market would be a dead end and started locking their sights into the worldwide market through the Famicom. So, the Stamper brothers sold a minority share to US Gold, which you should be familiar with if you have been following the channel, and if not, check out the Master System games published by this company. They're pretty... During this move in 1985, they founded Rare and started working on reverse engineering the Famicom in order to understand how it works. After tinkering with the console and every game they could get their hands on in a span of 8 months, they got to learn enough about the machine to make some tech demos for it, those of which were shown to Minoru Arakawa, then president of Nintendo of America, which became so impressed with what they were able to do with the console that they were granted unlimited budget and release schedules for it. It seems that Tim and Chris didn't mind much else other than just making games. And oh boy, make games they did. In the NES's lifespan, Rare developed a total of 60 games, of pretty much anything you can imagine, especially licensed games. I'm sure you're all well aware of how bad LJN was as a publisher, releasing terrible game after terrible game. Much of that awareness came through the AVGN videos, didn't it? He'd rage on and on about how LJN was awful and made shitty games, but what he didn't show us is who actually made the games. Nightmare on Elm Street? That was Rare. Amazing Spider-Man for the Game Boy? You can bet it was Rare. Oh, the Who Framed Roger Rabbit episode was great. I love it a lot. Wanna know who made the game? Obviously, by having an output of about 8 to 9 games per year for the NES alone, you're bound to have some stinkers. However, they did find some success in games such as RC Pro-Am, Snake Rattle and Roll, and, of course, Battletoads. Between varying degrees of success within so many releases through the years of 1986 all the way to 1991, Rare might have not been as well known as Ultimate was inside the UK during their prime, but one thing is for sure, they were raking in a lot of money. You'll see how I know this in a second. Geez, let me tell the story first. The games Rare developed at the time weren't really as innovative anymore. They were basically being used as a means to an end, as the Stamper Brothers could get their hands on as many different games as possible to learn as much as they could from each of them. These two were incredibly dedicated to the craft, but perhaps in too much of an unhealthy way, as this would translate into both working 18-hour shifts day in and day out, taking days off only during Christmas time. Chris has gone on record saying, quote, "We feel that a 9-to-5 work ethic produces a 9-to-5 type of game," end quote. Dude, what? Wait, hold on. The Stampers were known for working 18-hour days and believed that part-time work resulted in a part-time game. My brother in Christ, 9 to 5 is not part-time! When this NES rolled around in 1991, they decided to limit their output of games due to now being behind the curve and needing to start from scratch on learning an entirely new machine. And in 1992, they invested the profits earned in the NES era into Silicon Graphics Challenge workstations, of which went for sale, at the time, for a mere pittance of £80,000 each. Yeah, Rare got 2 of them. With this newfangled technology, Rare got to work on what they could possibly do with it. They began development on a game called Brute Force at some point in the early 90s, which would later on be transformed into what we know today as Killer Instinct. Nintendo, upon learning that Rare was working with SGI stations, through one of Howard Lincoln's, then Nintendo of America's president, routine scouting trips to Europe, sent representatives Tony Harmon and Genyo Takeda to inspect this demo Rare had developed. The demo, running on the challenge, would demonstrate a boxer capable of performing a dozen movements. Both were shocked and asked the Stamper Brothers to try and make it work in the SNES. 48 hours later, they managed to have the demo fully functional in the console, and Nintendo, which already had 25% share of Rare before this, would seal the deal and acquire 49% of Rare shares, making them a second-party developer and granting them permission to work on Donkey Kong using this technology. Donkey Kong Country was first unveiled at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show 1994 as a finale to Nintendo's conference. By this year, 32-bit systems were about to hit the market, and advertisements displaying all the possible things that those consoles could do were popping up everywhere, especially in this very conference. There were murmurs going on about Nintendo's next console being a 64-bit system, and consumers were left wondering what such a system would be capable of. DKC's unveil would show people the kind of graphics of which people had never seen in games at the time. But it would also drive one point home. It was coming for the Super Nintendo. Greg Mayles would recall in an interview that people at the conference were stunned, briefly sitting in silence before bursting into applause. The deed was done. People were hyped for Donkey Kong Country. Donkey Kong Country, released in November 1994, is sporting its signature pre-rendered 3D graphics using Advanced Computer Modeling, or ACM, a technique pioneered by Rare to make graphics entirely within a virtual environment, unlike anything seen before, and became an instant success. Rare's gamble really did pay off, and the game would end up covering its development costs 400-fold by the end of its first holiday release date. It underwent an intense 18-month development period with up to 20 people working on the game and had basically no interference from Nintendo's own developers, being entirely made by Rare themselves, being directed by the Stamper brothers with Greg Mayles as main game designer and Chris Sutherland and Brandon Gunn as lead programmers. Sutherland being tasked with the gameplay portion, while Gunn was tasked with graphics rendering. He uses a 32 megabit cartridge, needing more ROM than even a game like Earthbound or Final Fantasy VI. And even so, Rare needed to be very clever in how to use their assets, as Greg Mayles would later recall in an interview to GamesRadar that the backgrounds alone would occupy all of the ROM in a cartridge, so they had to cut elements from the single screen they had generated in order to have them repeat throughout the levels, while still maintaining the 3D model quality they were aiming for the game. While being quite the technical feat of engineering, the game itself is quite simple and easy to pick up. It tells the story of how the Kremlins caught Diddy Kong lacking in an ambush during a stormy night and shoved him inside of a barrel and threw it in the middle of the jungle, later stealing all of Donkey Kong's bananas. Why would they need his bananas? I don't know, lacking potassium? Cranky Kong would say it so we could have a game, probably. Donkey Kong wakes up from being a lazy bastard and is told by Cranky that all the bananas were taken away, and so has Diddy. DK feels guilty from being a bum and rage from having his banana stolen, so he does just like Shulk and swears to make all the Kremlins pay for what they did to his bananas and to Diddy! Diddy is a new character introduced in this game, as well as the other Kongs that are not Cranky or Donkey, since Cranky is supposed to be the original Donkey Kong while DK is supposed to be Donkey Kong Jr., but that is neither here nor there. During initial stages of development, Diddy didn't have much of a mechanical difference to DK, as he was being used mainly as a visual reference to a life bar, much like how Mario grows bigger when he has a mushroom power-up. However, as time went on, they began integrating the second character further into the game's mechanics, providing Diddy with his own characteristics, diversifying gameplay a little bit, and unbeknownst to them, creating a character that would stick around for a really long time. DKC plays like a charm. It's a very by-the-numbers platforming game, but it's not something you would usually see from an European developer at the time. It's hard to really explain, but it feels like it was Japanese made. It seems that Rare really did learn a lot during their time messing around with all those NES games, and it's finally paying off. The physics are tight. You can roll, run, and jump, and much of the precision you get with platforming in this game comes in conjunction with using your rolls, as you can roll off edges and jump in midair to cover great distances. Something that is not told anywhere, but some levels are designed with this in mind to get things like Kong letters or to find bonus levels. You are more agile, nimble, and jump higher as Diddy in exchange for not being able to kill some enemies, or needing to hit them more than once, while as DK you are the exact opposite. Also, as DK you can pound on the floor, which was an idea given to the team by Miyamoto that was added pretty late in development, so yeah, it's a bit undercooked. You can use it to find some hidden things in the levels, but you forget that it's in a game past the first couple of them. The levels were designed with great inspiration from Super Mario Bros. 3, as they were made with the intention to have a nice flow to them, providing challenge to newer players while being great to see more experienced ones breeze through the entire level, and it feels great to play them. Sure, I don't think that every level is a hit, and maybe things slow down a bit too much in the later worlds, but most levels are really solid, unique, and provide the right amount of challenge and don't rely too much on gimmicks, while still introducing some new concepts when necessary to keep things fresh. Sometimes even the levels themselves reflect the progression you have through the game, and it's incredibly clever. For example, in the Gorilla Glacier levels, you start out in the snow-covered mountains. Everything seems to be alright. But as you progress through the first level, the sky starts turning gray and a snowstorm approaches. By the midpoint, the snowstorm is at its strongest and you're in the thick of it, needing to finish the level by going into an igloo. This igloo is actually an entire crystal cave. You get to traverse through the caves to get to the other side and continue your journey, and when you get out, you are back to the middle of the snowstorm. However, this time, as you progress through the level, the snowstorm starts going away until the skies turn clear once more. It's just really cool, man. What can I say? The levels also are filled with secrets for you to find. Each level has up to 3 secret barrels or entrances to be found by either breaking walls with barrels, trusting that certain bananas aren't just baiting you to certain death, or by using a magnifier on the screen to identify that those 5 pixels at the bottom actually are the rim of a barrel and you should jump straight into it. Do you think these are way too obscure? Well, so do I. Also, I tricked you. Some levels have 4 secrets in them for some reason. Sometimes 5. This one has a secret within a secret even. How am I supposed to know that? These secrets are what you need to find to tally up your completion rate to 101%. Why 101? No idea. Do you get anything different for it? You do not. Yay. While still speaking of the levels, I particularly feel a certain distaste to this game's water levels. You see, there aren't any bonus levels in them, which is nice. That means that you get to just worry about getting to the end, and that's all you have to do. But they still are filled with hidden stuff that you only get to find if you keep hugging all of the walls. There never is anything hinting you to something hidden, and that just makes me mad. Good thing this rage is immediately soothed by David Wise's marvelous compositions. This game's soundtrack is absolutely gorgeous, and I can say without a doubt that Donkey Kong Country wouldn't be so fondly remembered if it wasn't for its astounding musical tracks. They initially thought that the soundtrack would be composed by someone from Nintendo, as tends to be the case. Well, the circumstances of which this game was developed under were so unusual at the time that no one really knew for sure. But with today's knowledge, we know that Metroid Prime soundtrack was made by someone from Nintendo, so the demos that Wise made that were sent to Nintendo, of which he tells us were put together and is what we listen to in this game's first level, must have thoroughly impressed the folks at Nintendo, as they returned with a request for Rare to make the rest of the soundtrack. Wise would then work mostly isolated from the rest of the team in a, I kid you not, converted cowshed. You can't make this up, man. Okay, for context. Rare's headquarters are located in the city of Twycross in England and were initially established in a manor farmhouse. It is downright hysterical to think that one of the UK's most technologically advanced software companies by 1994 made one of their best-selling games in a bar! Wise and Fisher's compositions are diverse, memorable, and fitting. I find difficulty in describing how good this soundtrack is, as I'm not versed in music theory, but the songs really manage to sell each of their locations. The starting jungle levels with a focus on percussion like bongos to invoke this primal feeling, followed by the sounds of water droplets echoing in the distance in the cave levels, and later on, the overall stillness and suffocation provoked by the mine levels. These mines, not those mines, perfectly fit the overall aesthetic brought by them. However, even if the songs don't really fit, we still get to listen to beautifully composed tracks such as aquatic ambience for the water levels, life in the mines for those mines, not these mines anymore, and ice cave chant for the few ice cave levels in the game that, in this particular case, aren't just beautiful but also really fit the entire aesthetic of the level. Don't let the soundtrack obfuscate the great sound design from the game though. Some people say that bad sound design you notice, while good sound design you don't. But great sound design you end up taking with you. The sound the bigger Kremlins make when you stomp them is irreplaceable. The barrel explosions are punchy, you get great feedback when landing from jumps, and enemies in general can be easily recognized by the sounds they make. I still think the game looks really good. I've heard people say that the 3D look is gaudy and some other games have aged better than this one. I guess, to be honest, for such early 3D like this, the models still look really good. I suppose it has to do with how they were translated to very small sprites, so you don't get to see all the imperfections from 3D models from this age. At least for the sprites. Some of the backgrounds do have this particular look to them that you either like or not. I personally don't mind if the trees look like they're made of rubber. It gives the game this particular look that isn't really replicated elsewhere. Other sprite-based games do look a lot better nowadays and have aged like fine wine, but I appreciate how this game looks. Not just due to being part of my childhood, but for looking unique while still looking quite good, even to this day. Last, and I guess also least, the game features animal buddies which show up in certain levels. While they do spice up the gameplay a little bit here and there, I'm not particularly too fond of them in this game, as they are pretty one note. Rambi can be used to blast through levels, Expresso can fly, Winky can jump high, and Engard is a swordfish that, I'll admit, makes water levels more bearable. And Squawks shows up one time to illuminate a cave level that isn't really that memorable. It can be argued that the levels these buddies show up in are made with them in mind, and I agree with that, but at the same time, I don't think that they change gameplay that much to make any noticeable difference. Now, there's this quote that goes around related to this whole story claiming to be from Shigeru Miyamoto in an interview with Electronic Games in 1994, which says, quote, "Donkey Kong Country proves that players will put up with mediocre gameplay as long as the art is good," end quote. And that Yoshi's Island was developed as a direct response to the reception DKC received at the time. I'm not really the best person to be playing as internet detective here, but objection! This is all a load of bullshit. First, because Yoshi's Island was already being developed in tandem with DKC, but also because Miyamoto, despite not being directly involved with the game, was still around giving Rare some advice on certain things. Greg Mills, DKC's game designer, has gone on record saying very much so. So it would be, at the very least, very disingenuous for Miyamoto to say the game is bad. No one has been able to find this quote, but it has since been spread by both Bloomberg and IGN, which, if anything, just goes to show that games journalism hasn't changed much during the years. Alongside Donkey Kong Country, Rare was developing Donkey Kong Land for the Game Boy. which is just as technologically impressive as DKC is for the Super Nintendo. They used all of the same technology but had to reduce things way down in order to be able to fit the even tighter ROM restrictions and display capabilities of the Game Boy. Designed by Andrew Collard with programming from Paul J. Designed by Andrew Collard with programming from Paul J. Machacek, soundtrack from David Wise and Graham Norgate, and some returning staff from Country with Steve Mayles on sprite graphics and Chris Peel on graphics manipulation, Land was released for the Game Boy in summer 1995 and was received quite positively by the press at the time. It has much of the same characteristics that made DKC so popular, but on a handheld, and here, Kong letters can be collected in each level in order to allow you to save after finishing a stage, if you collect all of them, which is a nice addition to a portable game. Some people might not like this, but I think it's not a good game. Oh, it's just because it's on the Game Boy and doesn't look as good. No, that's not it at all. I've been surprised by Game Boy games before, such as with Metroid 2, but Donkey Kong Land just feels off. The physics are off, hitboxes are off, it takes an eternity to get control back after you are hit, and if you get hit over a pitch, you're probably just dead. Sometimes I can't tell what is a platform and what is supposed to be background, and the death barrier follows you around like a goddamn assassin, making vertically focused levels a pain in the ass to play. I do think that the visuals are alright, and so is the soundtrack, even if the title screen theme makes me immediately think that I just bought a bootleg version of Donkey Kong Country. I just didn't really enjoy my time with this game. It wasn't particularly challenging, and most of the times I did die were because of the game's technical limitations going into full force and killing me in some stupid way, or because I just didn't have enough time to react to an enemy as it appeared on screen. I really do wonder where these great rankings came from, because most of the criticisms I have with this game are improved in the next one, but we'll be talking about that one later. Did you know there's a Game Boy Color version of Donkey Kong Country? Oh, you did? Well, I didn't. It's news to me, really. I've always heard people talk about Donkey Kong Land and the GBA ports, but never about this one singular game in the GBC. Would you be shocked if I told you that Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color is very similar to the original game on the Super Nintendo? I know I'm shocked. I was caught by surprise in seeing that the level design is as close as possible to the original game. Except they added an extra level and extended Winky's walkway in the second world. Honestly, it's pretty insane they managed to port the game this well to the GBC. Yeah, it doesn't play as well, as some wonky hitboxes are still present and the camera moves way too quickly when you're just trying to adjust your positioning. Winky in particular feels worse to play with as you don't have coyote time for some reason. Sometimes you just don't pick barrels up and that messes up the flow. And there are some stages that are objectively worse to their 16-bit counterpart because some game design aspects were taken for granted. For example, in Forest Frenzy, in the sections where you need to avoid the bees while hanging onto a rope, it is really difficult to react to where the bees are going, because the camera is dead center on the screen. This part gave me some major trouble, and you can wonder, well, it's about memorization, is it not? It isn't. I immediately booted up DKC on this NES, went to this level, and cleared this section on the first try. The extra time really makes a difference. It's weird too, since the original game shifts the camera to the right so the player can look ahead, but some of the prior ropes in this very same stage also do that. But this one doesn't. It also looks and sounds worse, but that's a given. It looks and sounds pretty good for this console standards, on that note. I'm not too used to Game Boy graphics, but I'm sure this is taking it to its limits. Unlike Donkey Kong Land, this port brings back some of the music tracks from the SNES version, which is nice. The ROM size is pretty small, so only a few select tracks made the cut, but I like their rendition a lot. Despite myself thinking that it's a high fidelity port to the original game, I do have some qualms with it, primarily in regards to the gameplay. But first, that extra level. Why was it added? I'm not sure. It's not a particularly challenging level in the first place, and it'll barely add to the runtime of the game, but it feels so out of place to everything else. You get to the stage and can immediately see just how different this level is designed compared to everything else. It feels off. The entire philosophy of keeping a certain flow when traversing the stage is thrown off the window in this one, as there will be Neckies shooting coconuts in places where you can't dodge. So your options are either taking a hit or waiting for the right moment. It doesn't feel good and doesn't fit with the rest of the game. So the gameplay. While the physics do feel better to Donkey Kong Land, some other things just feel awful, primarily tires. For some reason, it just doesn't feel right to jump on them. Sometimes the jump just isn't recognized, so you just keep the A button pressed to get the most amount of air possible. However, you don't want that all the time, as in a stage like Rope Bridge Rumble, you are required to time your jumps correctly in order to not hit the zingers in a way. Not only that, but every section like this one is terrible to play because not only are the tires janky to use, but they just change direction without any prior warning. No gradual slowdown like in the Super Nintendo game, just BAM! Going the other way. See you in hell, DK! Before moving on to Donkey Kong Country 2, the first game had one more port released for the Game Boy Advance in 2003. Okay, sorry, this filter makes my eyes hurt. I'll turn it off. Unlike its predecessors, the GBA is much more advanced and capable as a console and easily surpasses what the Super Nintendo can do in terms of raw processing power. So the graphics overall look the same as they do in the home console. In fact, they are the same. Though not because Rare still had the assets around, those were lost somewhere in a farmhouse. I don't know, the chickens probably ate them. Designed by Gary Richards with programming from Trevor Atwood, James Simmons and Rob Ware, Chris Peel and Kerry Gunn returning from Donkey Kong Land for the graphics and music by Robin Beanland and Jamie Hughes, they had to rip the sprites from an emulator in order to use them here and had to program the game from scratch, as the source code likely was eaten by the chickens too. They managed to replicate the feeling of the original game really well, for the most part. I don't know what it is, but for some reason DK doesn't feel as bad to play as. The contrast between his mobility and Diddy's in this sport is a lot more diminished here, and I felt that straight away when jumping from tree to tree in the first level. You see, DK usually starts falling like a rock as soon as you roll off a ledge, while Diddy stays in the same height for a little bit longer before falling. But this time around, DK just feels lighter, so I really don't see any reason to play as Diddy other than being forced to. In esports, they show you the story that was in the original game's manual when you select a file. It's not much of a big deal, though it's not like I needed the proper context for what was happening in the first place. If I didn't feel like reading the manual, why would I feel like reading this while in the game? Regardless, it's the same thing. They added some minigames such as fishing and dancing, switched the stage order around for some reason, and replaced Funky's Fugue You from the original game for whatever this is. Soha, you're a hater. This hits Funky a lot better than whatever the hell was the original version. You're just blinded by nostalgia. Yeah, I don't care. Now, for the sticking point against this game. Due to hardware limitations, aka the GBA not having a backlit screen, they had to increase the brightness and contrast way up in order for you to be able to see anything. I'm sure it looks a lot better in a proper GBA screen compared to the emulator, because I see this same visual problem when emulating F-Zero Maximum Velocity, and that is a game I own and have played on a GBA proper. But it doesn't look that darker on a GBA screen, at least not enough to justify having the background of the mine levels look like someone just popped a flashbang in them. My biggest gripe here is that it completely ruins the mood set by these levels. They're supposed to be dark. They even tend to have these precariously looking hanging lights on them to show you just how dark and dreary these levels are supposed to be. And yet, the background in the sport looks completely washed. This is easily showcasing loopy lights. Let me show you some gameplay and you can see what's wrong with it. Yeah, you can play without the fucking lights. Not only can you play without the lights, but it looks so much better too. And another thing. Am I missing something here? Can the GBA just not do something properly dark? Or was this the development team being incredibly overzealous by the lack of backlight? In Blackout Basement, you cannot see anything when it goes dark. In the original game, on the Super Nintendo, you can still see vague shapes in the dark as it isn't pitch black. Oh yeah, sure, Soha, we get that this NES had the best graphics and could do all that. This is on portable though. Okay, so explain to me, why does the Game Boy Color also do it? Your Honor, I would like to call bullshit! Another change done for this port of the game are the sound effects, done by Evelyn Fisher, that were completely overhauled. For the worse, in my opinion. You can say it's nostalgia or whatever the hell else, but I don't like these stupid voices they added for the Kremlings. It doesn't really fit them at all. That is so memorable, yet here it's just lame. Many other things range from sounding about the same or worse. And that's just how the sound design was taken. I think it's a shame. The GBA sports better hardware compared to the Super Nintendo, and I can see how this was a decent way for people to experience this wonderful game in 2003, nearly 10 years after the original's release. But this port is just inferior to the original in every way. Honestly, there's no reason to come back to it. The Super Nintendo version not only has been re-released in nearly every Nintendo console since the Wii, but it's just better. A shame, really. I feel as though there was potential to add some really cool extra stuff here other than just the lame minigames and a photo album, but alas, I suppose Rare was already on the way out and they felt like making a quick buck. The principle of inertia is Newton's first law of motion. It states that objects have a tendency to stay in motion. Rare's inertia upon making the first Donkey Kong Country game was massive, as they started development on a sequel before even knowing how successful the first game would be. Greg Mayles has stated in an interview in Retro Gamer issue 181 that there were so many things left out of the first game that they could use in a second one that, as soon as the success was known, they already knew what they could do. The plan? Be risky. Be bold. Dish that Donkey Kong old farts for the new blood with Diddy Kong and Dixie Kong. Make a bigger, better, and more challenging game with new areas, new levels, new features, and shift the focus from speedrunning to exploration. Primarily to shake the formula up a bit, but also to extend playtime. But beating levels quickly still is possible, and players can still beat a level when playing it for the first time by just following the flow. The pirate theme derived from Mayo's lifelong fascination with pirates. DKC2 was developed in about 12 months and became yet another smash hit for Rare and Nintendo, becoming the second best-selling game in 1995 behind Yoshi's Island with 4.37 million copies sold, and without a doubt, one of the best action platformers of all time. Released in December 1995 and maintaining much of the same development team, Donkey Kong Country 2 improves on its predecessor in every possible way. The graphics, while similar looking, provide more detailed backgrounds and moving elements. Kremlin design is much more striking, memorable, and easy to identify, and also see on the screen. The gameplay and controls, while feeling as tight as before, has many more features this time around. Diddy and Dixie play much more differently from each other. While Diddy is basically the same as before, Dixie has the defining trait of being able to glide, making platforming a lot easier and allowing the traversal of great distances on air, making each Kong essential for certain platforming challenges and influencing the player to switch between both of them during gameplay. Not only that, but by pressing A, they climb on top of one another and can be thrown to reach greater heights. The level design has been greatly overhauled, not only providing great challenges and fun gimmicks, but bonus areas actually offer a tangible reward that can be used to access the secret world, and each level has a DK coin hidden somewhere in it that, while not being used for anything other than for collection's sake, does make it necessary to be smart and know how the game works properly to manage to get each and every one of them. Water levels now have secrets in them, as with any other stage, which make them doubly frustrating when you need to hump every single wall imaginable to find a hidden path that is necessary for the DK coin, but also doubly rewarding. Together with how some stages can both have water sections and normal platforming sections, something that was not present in the first game. Animal bodies now have much better defined purposes and are much more fun to play this time around, with Squitters being the big highlight with its ability to make web platforms anywhere you want. And some stages are made with these buddies in mind, as this time around you can transform into them and can only be transformed back after a certain point in the stage, adding a welcome variety to gameplay. Bosses are much more complex and varied. While in the first game you would either jump on them until they die or hit the big B with a barrel, here bosses require certain specific challenges to be overcome in order to defeat them. Plus, they also look quite threatening, like Cleaver being a sentient cursed sword, Cudgel being a big buff Kremlin that somehow isn't blowing up the charts in E621, and Crow just straight up coming back from the dead to haunt you. The sound design still is as good as it has ever been, with some great improvements done to certain sounds that, while they weren't bad before, in this game they become much more stylized and familiar, together with the soundtrack just somehow being even better than last time. The dev team must have been working like clockwork around this game to make it better than ever, because many of the criticisms I have with the first one are gone. Bonus levels are actually fun to play and have an incentive to finish them. No buddy tokens that exist solely to give you even more lives and ruin your stage progression. Really, every time I would see one of those tokens, I would just avoid them like the plague. Diddy and Dixie play so differently, I actually have a reason to switch between the playable characters. As reviews were coming in, they had to be taking notes to not make the same mistakes again, and it's impressive just how much they upgraded for the sequel. I really have no clue how they managed to one-up an already great game in every aspect, but they did it. I cannot think of a single criticism I may have against this game. Yeah, sure, you need to spend 2 banana coins to be able to save if you have already used the save point before, but they're so easy to acquire that it simply isn't a problem at all. If you really are that desperate in need of saving the game, just get good, Chris. Also, I didn't touch on the story because I don't care. It probably is in a manual somewhere, and it's sold in a GBA version of the game. Basically, the Kremlins come back and kidnap Donkey Kong when he was just chilling at the beach. Riveting. Much like with the first game, Donkey Kong Land 2 was also developed in tandem with Donkey Kong Country 2 by Lee Shunman on game design, Robert Harrison on programming, and graphics by Kerry Gunn and Dean Smith, and released in September 1996 for the Game Boy. Unlike the first game, however, it feels much better to play and it does follow on the building blocks laid out by its Super Nintendo counterpart. Probably due to having the game engine being built from the ground up this time around instead of reusing one made for Battletoads. For starters, it doesn't feel like Teemo Donkey Kong Country, so that's great. We got Grant Kirkhope to thank for the wonderful conversion of DKC2's soundtrack to the Game Boy sound chip. Much like how DKC2 was a straight upgrade to DKC1, Land 2 also is a straight upgrade from Land 1. But unlike Country 1, Land 1 wasn't good, so Land 2 had a lot of room for improvement, starting with the level design that follows much more closely to the home console counterpart, with some of the same stage gimmicks and much of the progression you see in Country 2, while respecting the hardware limitations. Oh, and vertical levels are actually decent now, since the camera does manage to follow you around and you won't fall into an always present death barrier below the screen. I do need to say, however, that some stages kind of go too overboard in their use of space. This one got a lot of empty space while you're using Squawks, so looking for that DK coin is a bit of a pain in the ass, and Glimmer's Galleon is pitch black until you hit the barrel to turn on the lights, and it's simply massive. Look at this map! The controls are improved. Bouncing on enemies jerks the camera a lot less and makes me feel like I know where we'll be landing. Probably due to the gameplay being slowed down a bit, and hitboxes don't feel as bad. Though I do need to wonder why did they decide that placing the web platform as squitter should be done by shooting first with the B button and then pressing select, instead of, just pressing select twice in an attempt to mimic the controls from the SNES version. I digress. It doesn't matter much, maybe I should have just read the manual. Guess I never learned. Donkey Kong Land 2 feels much more like what a handheld version of Donkey Kong Country 2 would be at the time compared to the same thing done in the first game. If all you had was a Game Boy and wanted to get in the Donkey Kong craze, then this would definitely satiate that craving. But while talking about portable versions, how does the GBA port of Donkey Kong Country 2 fare? Is it better than the port of the first game? Not really, no. Released in November 2004, Donkey Kong Country 2 for the Game Boy Advance has much of the same problems as the game that came before it, with the overblown contrast due to hardware limitations, taking away much of the mood and gimmick of darker levels, and a lot of the iconic sounds were replaced by worse, less memorable versions. Like, way worse. Unlike the first game, the minigames that were added in this one are necessary to be completed in order to get 100% completion, and to me, that's a terrible thing, because they're not good. One of them has you controlling a helicopter in a multitude of stages, getting harder as you progress through the game. Controlling the helicopter isn't particularly challenging, but I still wonder why this was added to the game. I don't think it's fun, and it's so disjointed from the rest of the experience that I would rather not have to engage with it. The other one has you using your own espresso to race against a lot of other espressos, just in case I wanted to play Uma Musume, but without any of the actual monetary investment in anime horse girls. You collect these golden feathers in stages and use them to upgrade your own bird. Is it necessary? Not really, if you know what you're doing. I accidentally got in a race in a Lost World against 3 GigaChat Expressos, but I mugged them all because the AI is incredibly stupid, and as long as you keep hitting the dash plates, you rarely stay behind. Overall, it's the same game from 1995, but with worse graphics and sound and an extra boss at the top of the tower, which, sure, I suppose adding this boss is okay, since you would be ending this world in the game just with a cutscene. Though in the same coin, it also felt like a nice rug pull to show you that there still was a little bit more game to be played with an extra level before getting to the actual final boss. Finally, by 1996, Donkey Kong's momentum was coming to a stop, as the Nintendo 64 was hitting stores and people were getting their hands on the new 3D technology. Directed by Tim Stamper, with game design from Andrew Collard, Mark Wilson as lead programmer, and Mark Stevenson as lead artist, Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie's Double Trouble released in November and managed to attain decent sales, though not as much as the previous titles, probably due to the N64 coming out earlier in September and having people too enamored with Super Mario 64 and by the series' familiarity already wearing thin. DKC3 is considered to be the black sheep of the trilogy. And no, it's not just because Kiddy Kong exists. But I dare anyone to speak up on actually liking Kiddy Kong. But because the direction this game took was wholly different from the other two entries, Kremlings were completely redesigned and feel a lot more cartoonish, the soundtrack is not as memorable, the level design is too reliant on gimmicks and sometimes they hit well, but other times they really don't. There's a game-wide fetch quest you have to do in order to complete the game, and who the hell are these bears in the first place? Boss fights are a chore to do when they really want you to read the quirky story they cooked up this time around. It's not good. While Donkey Kong Country 3 is by far my least favorite of the trilogy, it is not without its merits. For starters, the soundtrack might not have as many memorable songs like in the first two games in the series, but Evelyn Fisher really managed to hit home with the somber and sometimes paranoid feelings portrayed by tracks such as Waterworld and Treetop Tumble. The latter, especially in a stage when you need to outpace a gigantic saw cutting all the trees in half. Listen, I get it. For some reason, the tracks people tend to remember the most fondly of are the relaxing, calming tunes that stick out because they don't make you feel like you're playing a video game. They invade your subconscious and switch modes in your brain that allow you to both play the game but also immerse in something else completely. Aquatic Ambience, Life in the Mines, Sticker Brush Symphony, Forest Interlude. They all are tracks that evoke this similar feeling of deep introspection and relaxation, which is what makes them so memorable. DKC3 does not have a track that fits this bill. However, I have to highlight how this game's soundtrack is woefully underrated. Go on, give it a listen sometime. Another thing is that while the level design might be overly reliant on gimmicks, many times to the detriment of the game, I do like how creative it can also be. The previously mentioned giant saw is one of those cases, but also a stage solely dedicated to beating it as quickly as possible. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I'm followed by this piranha that needs to be constantly fed, otherwise it will feed on me. Kind of annoying, but also pretty dope. I need to constantly be on the move, otherwise I'll be shot? Troubling and nerve-wracking, but interesting. I need to climb this rope constantly as it is burning itself up? That's a nice take on an auto-scroller. The point is that this game has many highs, but also many lows. Sometimes the lows are lower than the highs are high, which is why this game isn't my favorite, but it manages to be good enough. I do have to point out, I really like the puzzles involved with taking every DK coin in the game. I'm very attracted to puzzles myself, so trying to solve these is always a pleasure and a much more engaging way of collecting these things that don't serve any other purpose apart from making the completion percentage go up. What I said earlier about Kiddy Kong is kind of a joke, kind of not. I'm not a big fan of the big baby monkey in a blue onesie, but we're kind of back with the dynamic of the first game where Dixie is nimble while Kiddy is bulky and strong. Problem is, there's just one enemy in the game that you benefit from playing as Kiddy. For everything else, Dixie can deal with them just fine, and she becomes the go-to playable character because she's faster and can glide. Kiddy essentially becomes a Dixie throwing simulator, and that's how their dynamic is. Yeah, so because Kiddy is just so heavy that Dixie can barely hold him up, the gimmick is that Dixie can throw Kiddy to break certain floor spots, and that's it. I think that's used about thrice in the whole game. Differently from the rest, DKC3 has this sort of open world overworlds that you can traverse in. This is done in order to go from place to place doing this sort of fetch quest in the game where you talk to a bear bro, do a thing, get an item, and this item is for another cave and so on and so forth. This liberty of movement in the overworld is used in an interesting way in a couple of occasions where you circle around rocks in a specific form, usually hinted by one of the NPCs, and that opens up a secret cave for the banana birds. This is also done in order to unveil the secret world, Krematoa, with the hardest stages in the trilogy by far. Rocket Rush is straight A bullshit, and I will not be convinced otherwise. The familiarity does wear thin after playing these games in a sequence. DKC3 doesn't change enough to stand out from the rest. Rare also starts showing hints of this mentality that adding more and more things to collect is a good thing, which only works on turning the focus away from what really matters in the game. You know, the playing part, the stages, the jumping on things and having them go. The bosses also don't help in elevating this game since I don't like any of them. These fights are drawn out, not engaging, and some of them just look silly. They were probably running out of ideas on what to do. They even tried using different perspectives and different mechanics, but I never really thought that the boss fights were particularly interesting in any of the games. So making them drag for longer is only a downside, especially the final boss. Gosh. Baron K. Rulenstein is such a slow, tedious, and dragged on fight, it really leaves a sour taste in my mouth. About a year later, in October 1997, Donkey Kong Land 3 was released for the Game Boy using the same engine from the prior game and much of the same circumstances from the games before it. Much like Land 1, Land 3 does its own thing while being loosely based on Country 3. It plays well enough, much like Land 2, the level design feels familiar to what is done in the home console version, but is different in other forms. Though there are some quirks here and there, like these platforms that are much thinner than they look to be. Much like I said before, it is a nice compromise to have on a handheld console in 1997. The soundtrack here was made by Evelyn Fisher herself, a first for the series to have the same composer work in both the handheld and the console version of the games. I gotta say, she knocks it out of the park with the 8-bit versions of the tracks. No surprises here. Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance, however, does not have the soundtrack made by Evelyn Fisher. In fact, it was made by David Wise, and it boasts an entirely new soundtrack. Released in 2005, DKC3 for the GBA manages to be an oddball once more. It isn't just due to having the different soundtrack, but also due to changing the designs for the Bear Brothers, making them a lot uglier for some reason. This game also features additional minigames that you can engage with from time to time, and I think you don't need to play any of them. Maybe you do need to complete the bold ones that Funky has you do to finally set this banana bird free. Just the way Aaron Yeager would have wanted it. The Cranky's Dojo minigame is pretty bad, no further notes on that one. The bold ones are alright. The first one is kinda hard, but I managed to do it. Reminded me of GTA San Andreas for some odd reason. The other stage I played was pretty easy, so I'll assume that they vary quite a bit in difficulty. Graphics and sound are about the same quality as the other games from the trilogy in the GBA. Downgraded graphics and terrible, awful sound effects. I think that maybe the sound effects are a little bit better than what we got in DKC2, but it's not a high bar to pass. Perhaps the only reason to play this version of the game is in order to listen to the completely original soundtrack specifically made for it. From what I understand, David Wise was tasked with doing the renditions of the original songs from the Super Nintendo game, but the problem is that the GBA has a lot of trouble playing lower frequency notes, a main focus to the game soundtrack. So Wise decided it would be a better idea to create entirely new tracks from scratch, and the soundtrack might be incomplete, as K. Rulenstein's fight doesn't have an exclusive track to it. There is one thing I noticed, and it might be only present in these kinds of stages, but the music tracks are switched between two tracks when playing the stage on ground and on water, which is really cool and only present in this game. The soundtrack is quite the topic for contention between fans that need to fight between each other on which version of the soundtrack is better, for some reason. Myself, I personally prefer the original one due to being so different to the ones in the previous two games, and the moodier, darker tracks are a definitive highlight to me. The GBA version isn't bad. However, I was a little bit familiar with it by listening to the OC Remix DKC3 album, but I really was caught by surprise when playing this game for the first time, as I wasn't aware of this fact. But then everything made a lot more sense as to why more tracks in that album felt so different from anything I had heard before. I sincerely thought it was some sort of artistic liberty from the remixer's parts. I only came to realize this when playing this game, but both this one and DKC2 on the GBA are lacking the character switch animations that give them just a little bit more personality. It's not much, but it does make a little bit of a difference. Well, speaking of missing animations, you know when you go to Brash's cabin after beating his stage record and he gets all pissed and starts thrashing about, and you actually get to see that happening, and that transitions to the world map, which makes a log fall off into the river, unblocking a secret cave? Well, here's the same thing in the GBA. Yeah, so this port sucks too. I'm being too harsh on these GBA ports, I know. It's simply that nowadays there really is no reason to play them over their SNES counterparts. They did try to bring them back to a somewhat new public, and Rare was already on the way out from their relationship with Nintendo, so it's understandable that these ports are a bit undercooked and, in some way, are a reflection of everything Rare applied in their games in a decade prior. The Donkey Kong Country and Land trilogies really are a hallmark of gaming history in the 90s, displaying just what could still be done with the aging hardware of the Super Nintendo and Game Boy at the time, and launching Rare into stratospherical success, and deservedly so. All games in the trilogy are great, even if some might not be just the right cup of tea for some people. But it is undeniable just how much of a groundbreaking release the first game was in 1994, and how the graphics, that were revolutionary at the time, still look incredible today, despite their age and using really early 3D technology. Donkey Kong Country story is one that started by taking a big risk on purchasing those two supercomputers, one that paid off to degrees no one could have ever predicted. It is refreshing to look back at this era in the gaming industry where companies were willing to risk things in order to stay ahead of the curve, risks that companies nowadays would never take. After the release of Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance, it would be 5 years for the next country game to return with Donkey Kong Country Returns on the Wii. Not too long of a break if considering the sport, but way longer if we consider the original release for the Super Nintendo in 1996. That, however, is all I have to say for today. Do you want me to cover Country Returns in Tropical Freeze on another video? Then comment down below to let me know that, and subscribe to the channel. Subscribing shows your support for our work, and it is definitely appreciated. Help us reach 400 subs. Thank you very much, stay well, and take care.